Well, that's pretty awesome news to know that God breaks through our chains, and that's what we're sharing this morning. We serve an awesome and a mighty and a huge God, and it's a privilege to be here and to be able to share his word this morning and to share what he's been laying on my heart. A few years ago, I don't know if you remember, back in 2010, there was a gigantic mining incident that happened. And when Jorge Gallegos, a veteran miner in San Jose, in Chile's Atacama Desert, that's a mouthful, when he went to work, he figured it was just going to be a normal day. Just normal day on the job, those of you that work full-time and you walk in, just what you expect. And then he found out he was in the middle of one of the biggest disasters to date. And if you remember that story, the San Jose mine was more than 100 years old, and it was known for these really primitive working conditions. So that hot afternoon in August, a massive explosion occurred, and a rock, and if you think about the grandness of this rock, it was as tall as a 45-story building. It broke off the side of the mountain, and it fell through the layers of the mine, causing this massive, huge chain reaction. And that rock later on weighed in as twice the weight of the Empire State Building. That's crazy. Like, that is a gigantic rock. And obviously the damage was done. 33 miners were trapped for 69 days. New York Post journalist Larry Getlin wrote about this ordeal of what they experienced, and he said that at first the men had absolutely no idea what the devastation looked like. They figured it was going to be a few hours or, a few moments before they were rescued. They had no idea what had happened on the outside. And so they retreated to this place which they were told to go, which was called the Refuge. And basically the Refuge was a classroom-sized room that had steel-reinforced places. It had provisions for people. Provisions meant for 25 men for 2 days, so maybe worst-case scenario for them. But the provisions included, and I personally think this is really disgusting, a can of salmon, a can of peaches, a can of peas, 18 cans of tuna, 24 liters of condensed milk, 8 which were actually spoiled when they got to them, 93 packages of cookies, which sounds like the only good part of that, and some expired medicine. And then they had between them about 10 bottles of water to share amongst the men. So when help did not arrive the first or the second day, or the first week, or the second week, reality started to sink in that they were big time trapped. Death was kind of this new reality to this group of men. And then the days to come, they would ration out their food by eating a scoop of tuna fish and a single cookie. They would spend a lot of time in this teeny tiny room together, and you can imagine the smell of tuna in itself is enough, but gross bodies and everybody compacted into one place. People described that as some of the worst smell they had ever smelled, just like a dead corpse smell. They held prayer meetings, they played checkers, they tried to pass time, but you can imagine that they were picturing in their minds, it's going to take an unimaginable rescue to get us out of this situation. And as each day passed, there had to have been some kind of feeling in their hearts I don't know if there's that much hope that somebody's actually going to come. Peter found himself in a similar situation. Earlier that day, his friend had been put to death. King Herod had executed him because of his boldness in sharing his faith. And Peter knew that his turn was coming. He knew that Herod was after him, and eventually he did, in fact, throw him into jail, arrest him with the intentions of killing him. And I want to read to you the first part of his story in Acts chapter 12, beginning with verse 1. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. I've been picturing this picture of Peter, which if you saw my husband earlier at the start of the service, he was the guy clapping across the way. he's a pretty average-sized guy. I would say he's, average in height, average in weight. I picture him to be about the size of Peter, maybe. And as Peter was thrown into this place, this average-looking guy, Herod wanted to make sure there was no room for him to escape. And so he decided to have him guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers, which I imagine to be quite burly men, working around the clock, making sure that Peter would not leave that space. He chained both of his hands up, which wasn't typical. Only one hand would be chained up, but he chained up both of them, again, in hopes that there was no way that he could escape. And I picture Peter to be in that situation, and I think, if I'm sitting between these 2 big, burly, muscular guys, and then there's 2 more at the door waiting for you, there had to have been some kind of fear in your body to say, like, this is it. I'm done. I'm toast. There's no way I'm going to be rescued, or it would take something unimaginable to happen. Most of us haven't worked in a mine, let alone been trapped in a mine for 60-plus days. Most of us haven't spent a lot of time in prison with death hanging over our heads. But probably all of us in this room at some point or time have felt the chains of oppression, or have felt the chains of injustice, or have felt the chains of the things that imprison us. For some of us, it's sin that we can't escape. Some of us are trapped by addictions that are in our life that no one knows about, that we can't seem to break. Some of us are trapped by loneliness or self-hate or depression. Others are trapped by anger and hate towards other people that have done us damage. We carry these chains of insecurities in our life. We carry them around with us in our brokenness, in our need to prove ourselves that we're powerful enough that someday we're going to break through them. But it's pretty hard to fight through the clouds of despair. And just like Peter and those Chilean miners realize, when we look at our situation and look at the things that hold us back, we realize it's going to take more than ourselves. It's going to take an unimaginable rescue to break out of it. Several years back, a guy from the church that we formerly served at in Hagerstown, Maryland, he invited myself and our lead pastor to go visit his place of employment, which happened to be MCI, which is this gigantic prison in Maryland that houses like some of the worst acts ever. And he called us up and he said, hey, he's the assistant warden at the prison. And he said, hey, I want to give you a tour of the prison. And I was like, how about like a tour of Chuck E. Cheese, or I don't know, something other than a prison? I have no desire to walk through a prison myself. He said, I really want to show you where I work. And so we signed up, we decided to go. I got in the car from my house and I was like sweating bullets in the car. I mean, before we even like arrived on scene to this gigantic building of sorts. We got there, they took our phones, they took our IDs, they basically took everything but the clothes on our back, and we began to enter this series of locked doors. Locked door after locked door after locked door, where we still hadn't seen anybody. We were just significantly getting more and more locked in. And I thought, oh my word, like if something goes crazy, how are we going to get out of here? We finally came around people, and that didn't really make me any more at ease when we were around people. I looked as these prisoners were chained up, and they were told where to go and when to go there. They were sharing sleeping quarters that were the size of our bathroom at home. For a few hours, as I felt trapped and I felt on edge, knowing I was going to get out, hopefully in the end, I watched as these men were trapped in their own imprisonment. Men who had made choices that had really stolen their freedom. And as I've journeyed as a pastor over the years, I've noticed that it's the norm to encounter people that are imprisoned or that feel hopeless. It's the norm to talk with people who are struggling to escape addiction or to struggle to escape behaviors that they feel themselves bound up by. If you've read anything about the heroin epidemic in our world, in our nation, it is taking the lives of a lot of people. It's in a cycle of addiction where once you're chained up, it's pretty difficult to get out of it. And it's claiming the lives. Those things claim the lives of our brightest and best young people. When we're held captive by our fears or our insecurities or our hopelessness, something happens inside of us. And if you've been there or you're there this morning, you know you make choices you wouldn't normally choose. You feel sick inside. You allow death kind of to be the destiny. We're engulfed by this deep sense of hopelessness, and as a result, we suffer. Our homes suffer, our communities suffer, and we miss out on this freedom that Christ is offering us. It is freedom from fear, freedom from sin, and freedom from hopelessness. We have a rescuer, and he is in the business of making the most imaginable rescues that you could think of. And I want you to hear Peter's story, the rest of it, starting with verse 7. It says, "Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. 'Quick, get up,' he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Then the angel said to him, 'Put on your clothes and your sandals.' I don't even know how he would have time for that, but Peter did. 'Wrap your cloak around you and follow me,' the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and the second guards, came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they had walked the second length of the street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, 'Now I know without a doubt that the Lord sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were anticipating.' When this dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed she ran back without even opening it and exclaimed, 'Peter's at the door.' 'You're out of your mind,' they told her. When she kept insisting it was so, they said, 'It must be his angel.' But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. 'Tell James and the brothers about this,' he said, and then he left for another place." That is a pretty epic rescue. And I would have loved to be a fly on the wall when those soldiers came to and realized their prisoner that was shackled in so many different ways had been set free and was nowhere to be found. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in the room of the people that were praying, and Peter goes and knocks on the door, and the very thing they're praying for, there he is at the entrance, rescued. It was so dramatic that even Peter was surprised about it. It's pretty amazing to think about that, because Peter's life was a series of rescues. If you remember, he was rescued from this boring, mundane life of being a fisherman, and Jesus called him to follow him. He was rescued into this unbelievable adventure. He was rescued on the water when Jesus walked across the water and called to him, and he got all ambitious and then freaked out and started to sink, and Jesus rescued him. He was rescued after the resurrection, after he had denied his best friend multiple times. He came and he was rescued and given a second chance. And so for Peter, this wasn't the first time for him. There was a greatness in this rescue, though. After the rescue, as a result of the rescues, Peter, that was once known for this impulsiveness, he became this person who really believed Jesus could be his rescuer. In fact, he was given a new name. He was said that he's going to be called the rock on which the church would be built. The thing I noticed as I studied this passage was Peter's reaction as he was chained up. Verse 7 actually tells us he was sleeping between these people. I don't know about you, but if you found yourself in a prison cell and you were locked up in an impossible situation between pretty burly people, I don't think sleeping would have been what I would be doing. And he wasn't even sleeping lightly. The story tells us the angel had to strike Peter. The angel had to wake Peter up because he was in this deep sleep. Somehow, Peter had confidence. He had come to know and to trust his rescuer. And he knew that he couldn't break through on the chains himself. So it wasn't worth the time to sit there worrying about how he was going to escape. He had experienced the resurrection of Jesus Christ in his soul and had come to know that that was powerful and that it would move and it would work inside of him in even what seemed to be an unimaginable rescue. I think that's why he was sleeping that night. I've never been a great swimmer. If you ask the teens that were at camp last year, we did water aerobics, and I thought it was going to be great until they said you were going to be in deep water where you couldn't touch. And then I literally almost died. The pool noodle pretty much saved me, with some of the teen girls out there as well. If I were to get caught in a riptide, I would be lost. I would be helpless. I would not be able to help myself at all. But the beach that we happen to vacation at every year has these amazing lifeguards. there's something about them. I think all lifeguards should be good, but these ones in Stone Harbor, New Jersey happen to be like the best of the line. And every year we've gone to the beach and I thought, these guys are great. Like, I can get in the water. If I'm drowning, they're going to save me. I've watched them save people. They've saved my family members before. Like, they're legit. Until I got a toddler, and the toddler was at the beach. Suddenly, the lifeguards were non-existent in my mind. I remember bringing Baruch home. It was probably a summer after he had been with us, after adopting him. And we went to the beach. He was probably 18 months, 2 years old. And he could finally walk to the water. And I was like the psycho mom who wouldn't let him pass, 2 inches of water. Like, you need to come this way, you need to come this way. Like a hawk. And you would think after a couple years pass, it would get better. But it doesn't, because we were just there 2 weeks ago, and he's 4.5, and I'm standing now in knee-deep water going, you're out too far, you don't know how to swim. You're out too far, as though the lifeguards aren't going to do a thing if he gets caught. I don't always think that we have confidence in our rescuer. I don't know that we act as though he can actually rescue us. We know that's what he is. We know Jesus is our rescuer. But when it comes to the things that chain us up and the things we're thinking in our minds and our hearts, we don't always believe that he's big enough to do something. There's no way he's going to help our teenager break through. There's no way he's going to help me with a drug addiction. There's no way he's going to help my marriage. There's no way he's going to bring that friend that's forever far away from God back to him. There's no way he's going to take away my need for approval or my self-confidence where it lacks. He can't help with those things. You name the chain and it can't be broken. Jesus has come to set us free. That's what he's come to do for us. He's our rescuer, and he specializes in unbelievable rescues. And he's not new at it. It's not his first rodeo. He's been doing it since the beginning of time. And our scripture talks about our rescuer. He says he's the one that sets us free from bondage. He's the one that answers us when we call on him. He's the one who strengthens us when we're weak. He restores us. He delivers us. He protects us. And he makes us new. And he's come, as Isaiah 61 tells us, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and to release from darkness for the prisoners. He's our God. He's our personal God, and he's come to rescue us. So really the question comes back to us, do we want to be rescued? Are we people who are begging to be rescued? A few years back, I visited a teen who was in my youth group from my old church. She had been really struggling. She had been put into an institution. She was struggling with suicide. I'd had a lot of conversations before with her at that point, but I was called to go visit her. And for me, I had never been in that situation before. She had attempted suicide a few days before, determined that life was not worth living. And I walked into that space and walked down this hallway, apprehensive, in fear, maybe I'm not going to know what to say. It was very overwhelming. And as I passed through the hallway, I passed teenager after teenager after teenager with this just sense of hopelessness across their face. And I got to her room, and I realized she had the same look on her face. And I sat across, there was nothing in her room, it was just a bed and a couple little things she was allowed to bring. And I talked to her and talked about her family situation and her past and what she was thinking. And I found myself wondering, I don't know, that she can cling to the little bit of hope that I'm trying to share with her. Being rescued isn't really for the faint of heart. It's not you just get rescued right away and life goes on. Our chains are big, and we carry them for a long time. But I don't believe that God created us to survive in this world. I think he created us to thrive as people who live in freedom. And that night in the prison cell, Peter came to understand that same power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead was at work in his life. And so he knew that this resurrection life that he was living, that was inside of him, it wasn't timid. It wasn't a grave-tending life. It was adventurously expectant, as Romans 8:15 says. In other words, he already expected ahead of time, God's going to do something crazy here. I trust that he's going to break through in whatever way he decides. Deep down, I think we do want to be rescued, but it requires a surrender on our part. Several years ago, and some of you might have heard or know our story, but my husband and I were deep in the middle of an infertility journey, and I was pretty bound up by disappointment and anger. Like, there's not really any good way to describe that or explain that, but I was pretty angry and I was pretty disappointed. I felt imprisoned. Like, those were the chains that I was locked up with. Every single day that I woke up, those were the chains I was dragging around with me. And I remember my dad talking to him on the phone, and he asked, have you really surrendered everything to God? Like, that's a pastor thing to ask. He's a pastor. I was like, yeah, hello, I'm a pastor. Then he said to me, well, what if God had a different plan, and like it didn't involve your plan, and you weren't gonna be pregnant? Would you be okay with that? And I'm pretty sure I hung up the phone on my dad, and didn't answer him. And I obviously wasn't okay with that at that time. It was in those moments that I began to pray differently. God, have your will in my life. Like, I'm done with my will, have your will in my life. And that was not a pray that prayer and those chains, all of a sudden, oh, they're miraculously gone. That was hard. That was a prayer over and over and daily that we would take. I think when we surrender and we yield the power to someone else, we start to recognize it's not about us doing it on our own. We're actually in need of a rescuer. So those of us in the room that often think we're really strong people, even the strongest feeling ones of us, are still in need of the rescuer. God loves showing up in situations where he can rescue us. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, for my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Peter had no idea what God was going to do. He could have been beheaded the next day. He had no idea what God was going to do, but he obviously had gotten to this point in time where he trusted his rescuer, and he stayed put in the trust. If you want to be rescued, you have to stay put. After 2 weeks of being underground, the Chilean miners were starting to see the effects of not being rescued. They could hear the drilling, the story tells us, but they had no idea if the rescue was even going to happen or if it was really coming. By then, they resorted to only being able to have a cookie every 2 days. They were cooking soup broth in the industrial water underground, which was oily and dirty, which is so disgusting. My guess is they were sitting there devising up their own way to break the chains that they found themselves in. What are we going to do to get out of this? And trusting that someone was actually coming for them probably got harder and harder as each day tallied on. God doesn't always rescue us in the time or the manner that we think that he should, or as fast as we think he should. Some rescues, they do happen, in an instant. We've seen it happen where God will come and he'll move. But more often than not, it takes a while for him to come and to rescue. And I don't know that I fully ever will understand that until someday I'm sitting across from Jesus and can ask him that. But I know that I serve a God who sees the bigger picture. Paul, a prisoner, wrote about this very thing, and he also was thrown into a lot of crazy situations, which our teens are going to be learning about this week at camp. He says this in 2 Corinthians 4:16-18. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what's seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And I think when we feel like giving up, God asks us to stay put. He asks us to surrender. He asks us to wait on his rescue. Sometimes it's in the waiting that we see God's face the clearest. There were a lot of days on my journey where I wanted to give up, or where I just wanted to throw in the towel when it came to following Jesus. It wasn't like surrendering and praying that prayer all of a sudden like some stork showed up with a baby on our front lawn. That doesn't happen, if you don't know that yet. Didn't happen. It wasn't as though my feelings of disappointment and anger dissipated overnight. There were a lot of days still of wanting and waiting and wishing for a different plan. But we began to see we had this rescuer, and he had us. And he had his arms around us, and his plans were greater. He was bigger than us. He was faithful. And actually, in the really, really dark moments when we were face down, somehow his presence just lit up. It's crazy to think back to that. And he drew us close, saying, I love you. I haven't forgotten you. I've got you. Those were some of the hardest years, have been some of the hardest years of my life, but also some of the years where I could tangibly touch the presence and love of my Jesus, my rescuer. A great rescue requires one more thing, and it's to surround ourselves with praying people. As you read that story in Acts, and I don't know if you caught in verse 5, it says, so Peter was in prison, all locked up in his shackles, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. They weren't like just throwing out a prayer. They were earnestly praying to God for him. And what I find really interesting about this is when he goes to knock on their door, they're so deeply engrossed in their prayer that they don't even understand he's there, the very thing that they're praying for. I picture this group, this church surrounding, saying like, this is our guy. This is our guy. We're going to pray to this God that we believe in, and he is going to rescue our friend. God calls us to be praying people. James 5:16 says, the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. Our prayer matters as we deal with the chains in our life and as we deal with the chains in our friends and our families' lives. And the enemy wants us to believe that it doesn't make a difference, but it does. Jesus himself prayed. Author Philip Yancey says, I remind myself that the Son of God, who has spoken worlds into being and sustains all that exists, felt a compelling need to pray. He prayed as though it made a difference and as if the time he devoted to prayer mattered every bit as much as the time he devoted caring for people. He saw the need and he became a praying person. I've learned that prayer really does move mountains. This group of teens, there's 28 of them, I believe, heading to camp. And Pastor Stretch was sharing this morning, like camp was monumental in his life. Same with me. It's where I felt a call to ministry, to youth ministry. We pray for these teens because we want to see God break through things. We want to see the things, the plans that they have for their life, the things that are going on in their hearts and their souls and their minds. Like, we want to see God break through that. That's what we're praying for you this week. We're not praying that you have some epic time because it's awesome and camp is fun, but we're praying that, like, our rescuer comes and does the unimaginable. I have a group of people that pray for me often, and I've seen the difference that makes in your life. Like, prayer in the rescue makes a difference. On October 12th, 2010, 69 days after the horrific ordeal in San Jose, Florencia Avalos was the first man of 33 to be rescued. After finally breaking through to the men via a 17-inch hole, if you know how big that is, like maybe that, it took almost a month more to widen it to 28 inches, enough to send down a rescuer in a tube created to save the men. And I want you to watch this clip of his rescue because it's so awesome. I don't know if you guys were there for that. I remember watching that on the news, and that first person that popped up, whoa. Like, I've been picturing that, like that's our God, you know, it's a picture of what our God does to break into the situations that we find ourselves in. And there had to have been so many times that his son and his wife sat at night thinking, like, it's done. It is what it is. Like, this is the lot in our life. And as I watch that son just embrace, I think, like, this is this picture of our God who is a rescuer. He desires to rescue us from the things that have us imprisoned. And he doesn't want us to live as people that are hopeless. Maybe we've spent years trying to escape addictions. Maybe we've spent years praying for, like, that one person in our life that just can't seem to get it. Maybe we've spent years praying to be able to forgive somebody, but we feel like on our own, like, we cannot do it. Like, we're not enough. But he is big enough. He's strong enough for us. He's enough for us, but we have to be willing to say, like, I'm raising the white flag and I surrender to you. Some of us have been rescued multiple times and probably will be rescued tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. And if that's you and that's you in this space, like, God has called us to a job. We are called to be the people that pray. And we pray in a manner in which we believe, in the end, people will be rescued from the very things that have imprisoned them. He's calling us to pray with urgency. He's not asking us to just throw out a prayer. He says, be urgent in your prayer. Romans 4 says, the God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. That's how the God is described. Gives life to the dead and calls things as though they were not. That's awesome news. That God lives inside of you and lives inside of me. This past February, when I was on my trip to Honduras, there was a pastor there that preached from Ezekiel 37, the dry bones passage. And she prefaced her sermon by saying to us in a room full of people, this is for the Americans. Okay, there were like 25 of us in a room of 75 people. And that day, as I listened to her begin to speak about these dry bones coming to life, essentially the Lord rescuing a really desperate situation, I thought to myself, like, do I really believe that? Do I believe that God can rescue me from my fears, from my insecurities? Do I really believe that God can move and work in these teens' lives that are sitting up here that like, I want to see God do epic things with? Do I believe he can move in my friend's sickness that she has, or my friend that is like super far away from God? Do I believe that I serve a God that can move in that manner? And I've been asking myself that question these last 4 months. When it comes to the people that are chained and addicted and ourselves, do we believe that God can rescue? And I wrote in my Bible that day, whatever you ask of God, he will do. Trust him. So over the past 4 or 5 months, I keep hearing that passage. We keep singing about it in these songs, about dry bones coming to life and the greatest rescue ever. And I feel like God keeps saying, that is what I want. That's what I want for this church. It's what I want for your personal life. It's what we want for this world. And so I don't know, most of you, I don't know what chains you're carrying in. My guess is if we could see chains, probably the room would be full of them. And we would have dragged them up the big flight of stairs in the front, dragged them across here. But God is here to break the chains. He is here to give us new life. He is here to give us a fresh start. He is here to do what we think he cannot do. But we have to be willing to raise the white flag and surrender. And we have to wait on him. And we have to pray fervently. My hope is this morning as the worship team comes, they're going to sing a song about being stronger, God being stronger than us. Maybe you want to spend time praying in your seat or praying at the altar. Maybe you want to pray for yourself and some of the chains that you've carried in here. And maybe you have a friend that you're praying for, that you're hoping God is going to work and move in a mighty way. Maybe you want to pray for this group of teens that are coming this week, that God would shake things up and break through the chains. But I know God is a faithful rescuer. And whatever it is that you've carried in here this morning, he is big enough and he is faithful.
I know I needed to hear that message today. I needed to be reminded that God is a rescuing business. I got the opportunity to receive your prayers. And the Lord all this week has been reminding me about the peace that comes through a rescue. And he's assured me that my temporary physical ailments, first of all, they're temporary. They're minimal. Secondly, he's assured me that I'm getting healed. But I know for so many of us, you needed to hear exactly what Pastor Andrea shared. And so I want to take serious that call to prayer today. I want to ask you to get serious about it. For those of us that need that healing touch, come pray for your rescue as we sing. For those of us who know that lost loved one that just doesn't know Christ, that needs a rescue, come and pray this morning for that. If that's you yourself and you know that your sins got you just bound up, come and pray for your rescue. Let's not wait any longer. For those of us still dealing with the effects of long-term stuff, abuse that you've been through, addiction that you've dabbled in that's got you, come and pray for your rescue. We're going to sing a song called Stronger, that God is stronger than all these things. But not only that, he's faithful. So rejoice in the Lord always, even when you're in need of a rescue. Rejoice. Why? Because we have confidence in our rescuer. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious, stressed about anything, but in everything, come and pray. Let's do that together, church. It was my honor, my privilege to receive your prayers last week. Ooh, it would definitely be my privilege to pray over you this week. Come and join me. Let's pray for our rescue.
Please stand with us.